The key turned in the lock with a soft click. The door creaked open into stillness. Vera stood at the threshold of her own home, holding a bag in one hand and a plastic container of soup, her daughter's last-minute offering, in the other. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else. Memory. She stepped inside. It had been over a year since she'd last lived here. The furniture stood where she'd left it, the curtains still drawn just the way she liked them, but everything felt distant, like a photograph of a familiar place. The silence was deafening. For 12 months, her world had been filled with sound. Toys clattering, phones ringing, grandchildren laughing, the television humming even when no one was watching. Meals happened on schedule, dictated by school bells and office hours. Conversation was constant, and yet Vera often felt unheard. Now, the ticking clock in the hallway sounded like thunder. She moved from room to room, her steps echoing. Each corner whispered a different part of her past. Sunday mornings with her late husband, quiet winters spent knitting by the fire, evenings filled with radio music and the gentle turning of book pages. But instead of comfort, she felt a knot of fear twist in her stomach. Was she foolish to come back? Was this silence a sign of peace or loneliness waiting to devour her? That first night, she didn't unpack. She warmed the soup, ate a few spoonfuls, and sat by the window until the stars came out. No one called, no one knocked, no one asked her anything, and she realized she wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Elena's story, age 75. I remember the first night back in my house after my husband died. It felt like the walls had grown taller, but the silence taught me to listen again, not to others but to myself. That night, Vera barely slept. Her mind wandered like a child left unsupervised. But with the sunrise, something shifted. She opened the window and let in the morning air. For the first time in a long time, she asked herself, "What do I want to do today?" The silence was still there, but now it felt less like a stranger and more like a space waiting to be filled. The days that followed were a mixture of confusion and small triumphs. Vera woke up one morning and realized she hadn't set an alarm. No screeching reminder to make breakfast for others, no rushing footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Just the golden light slipping through the curtains and the gentle creaking of the old oak outside her window. She stayed in bed a little longer, not out of laziness, but because she could. She brewed tea slowly, watching the leaves dance in the pot. She ate toast with butter, not because it was what the children liked, but because she had always loved the way the butter melted when the toast was just right. These were small things, barely worth noting to anyone else. But to Vera, they were the building blocks of something she hadn't felt in a long time, ownership of her time. And yet, each joy was tinged with an ache of guilt. Her daughter called every other day, sometimes twice. Always concerned, always asking, "Are you sure you're okay, Mom?" The unspoken part hung heavy in the air. Why would you choose to be alone? Vera gave calm answers, but often hung up the phone with a sense of having to justify a choice that felt deeply personal. One afternoon, while tending to the dusty bookshelf in her living room, she came across an old pocket planner from years ago. She flipped through it. The pages were crammed with appointments, birthdays, meetings, and grocery lists. All tasks, all motion. And here she was now, with nothing planned, and somehow she was still here. She decided to stop waiting for others to give her days meaning. She started walking again, not far, just around the neighborhood. At her own pace, she took different routes, greeted neighbors she'd forgotten the names of, and watched the trees changing with the season. Some days it felt indulgent. Other days it felt like reclaiming something vital. The more she listened to herself, the clearer her needs became. She didn't want noise. She didn't want chaos. What she wanted was a life that made room for breath, for thought, for her. Joan's story, age 68. After retiring, I felt like I was waiting for permission to enjoy life. Then one day I realized, no one's going to hand me that permission slip. I had to write my own. Vera began turning off her phone for hours at a time. She placed a note on her kitchen wall, "Not everything needs an answer right away." Her daughter protested. "What if something happens?" Vera gently reminded her that something already had, and she was still here, managing. There were tears, and silence, and the beginning of something like mutual respect. Vera didn't yet know what the rest of her days would look like, but she knew this. They would be hers. And for now, that was enough. The third week in the house brought a restlessness Vera hadn't anticipated. With her mornings quieter and her days unfolding slowly, she began to notice things she hadn't paid attention to in years. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling at the corners. The rug in the living room, once soft and patterned with blue flowers, now felt worn and tired. And in the corner of the guest room, her husband's old study, stood a box she hadn't opened since the funeral. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a reflection of all the years she'd lived for others, for duty, for expectations. And now, standing in the stillness, Vera realized, if she wanted to feel new, this space would have to feel new too. She started slowly. The first thing to go was the cracked umbrella stand by the front door. It had belonged to her mother-in-law, and Vera had never liked it. But for decades it had stood there, unquestioned. She carried it outside, placed it by the curb, and felt an odd thrill as she returned to the hallway and saw the empty space it left behind. Next came the linen closet. Vera opened it and was greeted by a tangle of sheets, tablecloths, and mismatched towels. Some of it she hadn't used in years. Just in case, she had always told herself, but now she asked, in case of what? She sorted through each item, keeping only what she loved, what she used, what felt like hers. The rest she packed up in bags and brought to the donation center in town. The woman at the counter smiled and said, "Starting fresh?" Vera nodded. "Yes, I think I am." Each day brought a new project. She painted the kitchen walls a soft sage green. She ordered new curtains for the living room. She moved a chair to face the window, creating a small reading nook. The changes were modest, but to her, they were acts of self-respect. But the biggest transformation came when she opened the box in the study. Inside were letters, photographs, his old notebooks, and a small wooden figurine, a bird, carved by his hand the winter they'd first moved in. Vera sat on the floor with the box beside her and cried, not because she missed him more than usual, but because she finally allowed herself to feel it in a room no longer frozen in time. She placed the bird on the windowsill. It didn't bring him back. But it reminded her that love doesn't vanish when you begin again. Clara's story, age 71. When I cleared out my attic, I found pieces of myself in every dusty corner. It was never about throwing things away. It was about choosing what still belonged in my life. Vera's home began to feel different, lighter, warmer. Each drawer she cleaned out, each picture she hung, each room she rearranged. It wasn't just housework. It was a declaration, I am still becoming. And inside her, quiet doors were opening too. Doors she had long closed to dreams, to spontaneity, to joy that asked for no permission. She didn't know yet what she would fill those rooms with, but for the first time in years, she wanted to find out. It was a chilly Thursday morning when Vera met Nora again. They hadn't seen each other in years, two retired teachers whose lives had once been full of shared staff meetings, noisy lunchrooms, and long walks home in the dark. They met at the bakery, quite by accident. Vera had come in for a loaf of rye. Nora was already seated by the window with a coffee and a slightly distracted look. Nora? Vera? And just like that, time folded in on itself. They sat down together, the conversation hesitant at first, then opening like spring crocuses after frost. Nora spoke quickly, her sentences spilling out like a woman starved for adult conversation. She lived with her son now, he had insisted after her fall last year, and his wife and their two kids. A full house, Nora smiled, but the corners of her mouth trembled. She talked about how grateful she was, about how lucky she was not to be alone. But Vera noticed how often she looked out the window when she said those things. "I miss my little flat," Nora said softly, then sipped her lukewarm coffee. It was nothing special, but it was mine. They parted with warm hugs and promises to meet again. Vera walked home slowly, her thoughts heavy. If she had stayed with her daughter, would she be like Nora? Safe but stifled, loved but erased. That evening, she stood in front of her mirror again. The woman looking back at her had color in her cheeks, a new softness around the eyes. The lines were still there, deeper now perhaps, but they no longer looked like cracks. They looked like maps. Marjorie's story, age 69. Seeing an old friend who'd lost herself in family life was like looking at a version of me that could have been. It made me more certain living alone wasn't loneliness. It was listening to my own life. Vera brushed her hair back and whispered to the mirror, "Thank you for coming back." She didn't pity Nora. But she quietly promised herself not to follow that same path, not if she could help it. Her silence had become a garden now, and she wasn't done tending it. It began with a cough. A harmless one at first, dry, occasional. Vera brushed it off. The mornings had turned damp, and she'd been airing the bedroom more often. But by the second evening, she felt chilled, dizzy, and unable to finish her tea. The silence she had grown to love now sat heavy in her chest. She wrapped herself in a blanket, took her temperature, and reluctantly called her daughter. "You should never be alone like this," her daughter snapped, her voice tight with fear. "I'm coming tomorrow. We'll pack up your things and—" "No," Vera interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm not leaving." The silence on the other end was louder than any she'd ever known. She ended the call and sat quietly, watching dusk turn the garden gray. She was frightened, yes. Vulnerable, perhaps. But something deeper told her, you can get through this. The next morning, a knock on the door startled her. It was Claudia, her neighbor from 2 houses down. A woman in her 70s with silver hair always tied in a braid and a gaze like warm granite. She held a thermos and a small bag. "I saw your lights were out early. Figured you might need some broth." Vera blinked, then smiled. For 3 days, Claudia came by, not to hover, but to help. She brought soup, ran a few errands, and sat with her on the porch when Vera needed air. They talked in small doses. Claudia spoke of her late husband, her love for gardening, her belief in letting people live how they need to. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing yourself," she said once, slicing apples at Vera's kitchen table. Helen's story, age 73. "My daughter always thought independence meant I was being stubborn, but sometimes being stubborn is how we survive and heal." By the end of the week, the fever broke. Vera felt lighter, not just in her body, but in spirit. She called her daughter again. This time, her voice was calm. "I was unwell, but I managed. Claudia helped. I'm still where I belong." There was silence, then a sigh. "I just worry about you, Mom." "I know, but please don't worry more than I do." For the first time, her daughter didn't argue. Vera hung up, tucked the blanket around her legs, and watched the trees sway outside her window. The silence had held her, not failed her.